Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the Master Your Mental podcast. As you guys can see from the title today, we are going to be diving into uncovering complex traumas. And of course, I have an awesome special guest for you guys. Today, we have Andrea Hanson. She is a complex trauma expert with a master's in education from the University of Utah and a neurobiological breakthrough expert specializing in addiction and reshaping the psychiatric and mental health stigmas. I'm very excited to have her here with us today to dive into this topic. So without further ado, welcome Andrea to the podcast.
Thank you, Paris. It's good to be here.
Awesome. Good to see you. And I can't wait to dive into this because you guys, this is something we have not talked about yet. We haven't covered. And I brought the perfect person to uncover this topic and just completely get into it with us. But before we go ahead and do that, I want to talk a little bit more about you and what you do and what lights you up. So tell us a little bit more about you and all the things like that.
Yeah. So I really love my work. It's interesting to think that I love my work because it's working with a lot of complex trauma and really getting into the weeds. But I find that there is so much beauty and resilience that happened in these moments when we really, really dive deep. So a bit about how I got where I am. I grew up when I was really little. I wanted to own a bakery. I wanted to go all over the world and learn how to bake, and then bring back my favorite things and start a little shop with like some karaoke. I don't know. I had all kinds of great
Oh,
but as I went, I felt really drawn to the mental health industry. And that was in large part because I came from a really chaotic divorced household. And we saw a lot of therapists and psychologists, a lot of them court appointed, and they never really did anything. They kind of assessed and had conversations behind our back. It didn't really help much. And it was one of those situations where I did need help. And my sisters needed help and my whole family needed help, but we weren't getting help. We were just getting tossed around the system. And then in my teen years, which is a lot of times when symptoms of complex trauma start to show up in a bigger way than in childhood, I started to struggle pretty hard. And my parents responded to that by sending me to a treatment facility in Utah. And I don't know if any of the listeners are familiar with the treatment centers in Utah. There's been a whole big thing with Paris Hilton recently.
yes.
Yeah, have you heard of those?
Yeah, is it the Provo Canyon? Is it?
Yeah, that's one of them. It's a multi-million-dollar industry here in Utah.
Wow,
And it's a really, for the most part, terrible industry. So you go in unwittingly, for the most part, lose all of your rights. At the treatment center I went to, we didn't get to have shoes. We didn't get to stand up. We didn't get to look at each other or talk out loud. So I was there for 6 months, and I think I saw my therapist maybe a total of 2 times.
Oh my goodness.
So again, I was in this situation where I needed help, and the professionals assigned to help me weren't helping me. So I moved on from that, and then I really decided that I wanted to be a therapist that really helped people. Wow. So I started volunteering at the Rape Recovery Center when I was 18, and then went into graduate school. Well, went to school and then graduate school. And then I found myself in the mental health industry. And I found that there was so much red tape and so much in the industry that really holds it back from being effective. So after a couple years in the industry, I decided, you know what, I'm going to kind of step away from this and do what I know is really effective. After going to a ton of trainings and working with a ton of clients, I was like, I know what's actually effective, and I know what the mental health industry isn't allowing me to do. So I'm just going to go out and do it, what I know is effective. And so that's where I'm at now with diving into just being a complex trauma expert.
That is so amazing, especially how, you've taken your own experiences from being inside of the system. And you said 6 months at the treatment center in Utah and really seeing, the things that aren't working and what's going wrong and how the needs aren't being addressed, right? How you're dealing with this and you're struggling with this and something needs to happen or change to alter that, but there's almost like no solution. You've been trying all these things. And I think that's so wonderful that you took that experience and you didn't let it continue to be a burden or a problem for you, took it and you turned it into something that you can take and show other people like, hey, here's what I experienced and what I went through and what works. And here's a tool I can give you. So this can make a difference, because especially when we're talking about complex trauma, I'd love to kind of get into that with you and dive a little bit more into that. Cause I'd love to kind of hear you explain, what is complex trauma and what have you learned so far in your work that you've been doing about it?
Yeah, totally. It is interesting. We hear a lot about trauma and
Mhm.
PTSD, but we don't hear a lot about CPTSD, complex trauma. And that's in big part due to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM, that houses all of the diagnoses for the mental health industry. And complex trauma really encompasses all of the symptoms that are in the DSM. So it's not a specific diagnosis.
Mm.
But what it stems from is any moment in our lives when our systems are so overwhelmed that we can't move through it in a natural way. We can't be ourselves in that moment. We have to adjust ourselves. We have to either adapt to something that's happening so that we can get through it, or we have to mitigate around it to try to avoid it from happening again. That actually disrupts our neurology and our neurological development, especially when we're children. So that's what I mean by complex trauma, these moments that happen typically in the home or in complex settings that make our neurology disrupt and not develop the way that it's supposed to, which later in life causes symptoms. And it also starts to make us feel like there's something wrong with us.
Mm.
So in less complex trauma, so take like a car accident, for example, um, that you can go out and you can talk about. I was in a car accident. There's typically someone who was in the right and someone who was in the wrong in the car accident. So you can either be the perpetrator or the victim in that kind of situation. There's not a ton of shame around talking about it for the most part. But if you take a situation in the home, say, for example, you have a parent who actively struggles with addiction, and so they're not always at home, they're not always in their best, mental headspace to be dealing with children, then you start to question yourself. And evolutionarily, it makes sense for us to question ourselves rather than our parents, because we need our parents to survive. So we don't think, oh, my parents are an alcoholic, they have issues, but it has nothing to do with me. I'm a totally fine kid.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
think
Mm-hmm.
there's something wrong with me. I'm doing something wrong to make my life this chaotic, or to make my parent mean to me, or to make my parent not want to be around me. So that's
Oh,
that's where
wow.
complex trauma comes in. It's much more wrapped up in self-doubt and shame and neurological disruption.
Wow. So when you hit on that piece of shame, I thought that was pretty powerful, especially when you mentioned like the example, right, of talking about the car accident and being able to go out and, talk about this and say, this happened to me and this went on. But then when we talk about more complex situations and things like that, not being able to express that or know really how to communicate that in a way that, will work for you, right? So what have you found to be helpful in overcoming that aspect of self-doubt and shame with being able to break through these things?
Yeah, it's so layered, because what happens is we start to develop all these defenses around it and we don't even necessarily acknowledge it. So a good amount of the time we're living our lives totally on autopilot and not even realizing how much these moments of complex trauma are affecting us. They can manifest in so many ways, in an inability to concentrate, in chaotic relationships, even in obesity, or in autoimmune diseases. It comes up in the body in so many different ways. So the first thing to do is to acknowledge it and to say, you know what, if I acknowledge that I have complex trauma, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me. And it doesn't mean that anybody's the bad guy. It doesn't mean that anybody's to blame. I think that's one of the biggest barriers to acknowledging complex trauma, because we don't want to feel like we're blaming other people for our issues or thinking that our parents are bad people. That's not the case.
Mhm.
For the most part, everyone's doing the best that they can. And we can acknowledge that and also acknowledge that there are things that we need to look at within ourselves to heal.
Wow. And I love how you bring that back to that aspect of blame, right? And wanting to place that on others. But then when I feel like what kind of came across in the whole thing you said right there was compassion, right? So learning to develop this compassion and self-compassion for ourselves, because, something that I found is it's not that's something you're not taught. You're not really taught that anywhere, or how to have compassion for these things when these moments do happen, or when you're in these situations. Because I feel like what you said is so true. It's so much more common to shift to blaming yourself, or something must be wrong with me as a person, or defective about myself and the character that I am. And you kind of internalize that. And I feel like that is what, like you said, puts that barrier from being able to acknowledge it and say, this is what's gone on, and to acknowledge it. And then also express what you said, which was really great, is, there's nothing wrong with you as a person. And like, to start to take those steps of moving forward, I think is definitely, of course, like the first main step. And what would you say is like the most helpful for the like navigating, right? So from the beginning through that journey, is it something that's a lifelong thing, like continuously working towards this and prioritizing that? Or what do you think that overall picture of breaking down these barriers looks like for complex trauma?
Yeah, so with my clients, what I do is deep dives in the deeper neurological regions of the brain and in the body, because that's where trauma is stored. It's
Mhm.
not helpful. In fact, research shows that it's only 2% effective to talk about it. So if you're seeing a coach or a therapist and what you're doing is talking about it and trying to change your mindset around it, that's really not going to work. It might work in short little bursts, but then what happens is you end up in this war with your upper brain and your lower brain, and that can increase this feeling
Mhm.
of defectiveness within you because it's not resolving.
Mm.
Whereas if you focus more on the lower brain and on the body, you can really recalibrate the system to be able to react to your environment differently. And one of my favorite tools to use is psychedelics. And that it's a little bit of a
Yes.
taboo subject, but I really love working psychedelics. They've been used since the dawn of time in all kinds of healing and spiritual rituals. And one of the ones that is FDA approved pretty much everywhere, and that is really common but really misunderstood, is ketamine. But
Mhm.
ketamine is in the psychedelic family, and in high doses, it's used in like dental procedures and veterinary procedures, and also in battlefields, to get people dissociated enough to be able to perform surgery on them.
Mm.
But in very small doses, it's it's more of a psychedelic where it pulls away the upper regions of your brain that are those blocks and all those barriers and all those walls that we set up. And it makes it really easy to open up and dive down into the lower regions of the brain that's actually storing all of the complex trauma.
Wow, that is so interesting, because I feel like I've heard, a little bit about this, but I love having you on here to really break this down, because I feel like, people hear about, you get a diagnosis, right? Like you get diagnosed with depression or anxiety or with bipolar disorder. Like I was diagnosed with at 19, and you're put on these medications. And, a lot of people have such a hard time with, finding something that works for them or is effective, and kind of, it is kind of discouraging, when you go from this to this thing to this thing. And then it's almost like you start to find yourself in a state of being hopeless, almost like, oh, like I'm never going to find a solution. What am I going to do? None of these things are working. I'm trying this and I'm trying to stay positive. So when it comes to psychedelics, like with ketamine, you're talking about, have you seen like the differences between that opposed to like traditional treatment? So like taking like different medications that we hear about. What have you seen in your work that you've done with your clients?
Oh, yeah, totally. So, back to kind of what's going wrong with the mental health field and the DSM,
Yeah.
where that bipolar diagnosis is stored. It's that it's a manual that was created by psychiatrists in the 1980s who were trying to make the field seem more medical. They
Mm.
all needed a common language to use. So they came up with a DSM that housed depression, anxiety, bipolar, ADHD, borderline personality, all of those things, so that they would have a common language. But the issue was that they couldn't find any validity behind any of those diagnoses. So validity would mean that you can actually find the diagnosis in the body. So you go to the doctor and you think you might have strep throat. And the doctor doesn't interview you to see if you have strep throat. He swabs your throat to see if
Mhm.
you have strep throat. And then you either do or don't based on the test that's then done. And that's the validity behind the diagnosis, is the actual infection. And then based on the infection information, we know that certain antibiotics are going to be helpful in treating it. But with there being no validity behind DSM diagnoses, there is no effective treatment
Mm.
behind them. Unfortunately, though, the pharmaceutical companies had a total field day with the DSM, because if you don't have to actually validate a disease, you can medicate it. So you can get everybody on earth diagnosed with a mental illness, because there's no line between normal and mentally ill in the DSM. Even in the DSM-5, it's just gotten worse and worse with every edition.
Oh.
And there have even been several national research companies that have decided to pull all funding away from the DSM because it sent the mental health field in the complete wrong direction. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you have researchers like Martin Teicher, Ruth Lathius, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and they have been researching complex trauma. And there is validity in complex trauma. They can see the brain scans of how exactly complex trauma impacts the brain. So these medications that come with the DSM, that come with the psychiatric industry, average about 30% effectiveness, and they have really intense side effects. So the pharmaceutical company actually has some placebos out on the market, because placebos are about 30% effective too, but with no side effects. So people will be on placebos their whole life. Whereas ketamine, if you use ketamine to help heal complex trauma, the results are around 80% effective when used correctly with the right therapeutic support.
Wow. And I always find that so fascinating, because whenever I think about this, if I remember when I was younger, right? And when I was actually hospitalized myself and meeting people in the facility who were share with me, like I'm on 7 different medications, or I was actually pretty blown away by that. I was like, oh my gosh, because I know I was on one, and, still being on one and not that much of it, doesn't seem that much. But that's what I always think about, is what other things can we do or start to make available for people so they can, start to have this, I guess, like confidence in themselves that they can, get better and recover and heal. And I feel like sometimes there can be kind of such a dependency, right, on the medication. And, sometimes if the insurance or complications with insurance, and if you can't get the medication, and kind of like this fear of, what's going to happen to me if I don't have this thing, or if I'm not continuously on that. So, I mean, I would love to hear from you, some recommendations that you've offered to your clients in terms of taking steps to, do different things, whether you're implementing this into your day or to your routine, that can help with, improving our mental health. What things would you have to offer for that?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that I've been working on developing, I have all of the research behind it, but I'm not a computer person. So I've been working on developing what I call lifestyle prescriptions. So I do an assessment, and rather than finding a diagnosis, because again, invalid, not helpful. And if you get trapped up in that, if you have a diagnosis, then that's considered a chronic illness, then you're kind of a victim to this diagnosis that it really isn't real. The symptoms are real, but the diagnosis itself isn't real. And then there's not much you can do about it. But if you can hone in on the exact areas of the brain that are under functioning, which is what I do with the assessment, then there are specific things that you can add into your lifestyle to be able to heal those regions of your brain. So that's something that I have been doing with my clients, and something that I am making available. And a lot of the things are so simple, like just breathing. There's a simple breath where you can just make sure that you breathe out longer than you breathe in. And that brings your nervous system from a more hot state to a more cool state. So when you're feeling anxious, you're feeling tense, you're feeling like you need some kind of distraction, like sugar or drugs or whatever it is, breathing out longer than you breathe in. And we do that naturally when we're asleep. Kind of sounds like,
yeah, yes.
Yeah.
It works. It does. Like I've actually, like, breath work and like what you're talking about is, I remember hearing about that and thinking, like, what is this gonna, because I feel like being such a pessimist, like how I used to be, like, what is this gonna do? Like breathing like this, but then when you start to try it and you continuously make it a habit, you start to notice, like, wow, I'm not waking up so stressed out right now or instantly overwhelmed with all the things I have to do or all the things that are going wrong or all of these things that we like kind of layer up. When you start to do that, it really does make a difference. And, I would urge anyone who hasn't tried it to, there's so many free videos and tutorials out there on, especially on YouTube and like the internet of all places, right? To get access to that. So that's a great one. I love that. I mean, what other ones do you have that you've offered that have worked?
Yeah, totally. So it can be as simple as making regular eye contact with people. That can help with your brain stem and the lowest regions of your brain to activate and to regulate in a better way. So if you're struggling with sleepiness or not being able to sleep, or sometimes people struggle with random itchiness, especially when they're anxious, doing things like making eye contact with people and facial expressions, even mimicking or making facial expressions, like funny ones with other people in your life, can be really beneficial. And it seems super silly, but we have to remember that our brains have developed since the time we were in utero. When we're first born, we only have our brainstem and the very, very, very lowest region of our brain. And then over time, the rest of our brain develops. So in order to heal those lowest regions of the brain, particularly if you had a situation where there was an attachment struggle or adoption or something like that that happened at that very youngest age, then that region of your brain needs some attention. So getting that eye contact for it, or even tossing a ball back and forth and getting in rhythm with somebody else's body, is hugely beneficial.
Oh yeah. No, these are all so good. And I love these tips. And I love being able to hear a little bit, especially about your own experiences, right? And kind of, what really inspired you to get into this line of work and to really help people with this, because, I feel like the both of us know, a lot of what's wrong with the mental health system and in terms of hospitalizations and like all the stuff with different issues with medications and all of these things. But I feel like these conversations are so powerful because we can focus on what's going right, what have you tapped into, or what have you discovered that's been so beneficial to you, and in terms of just your recovery and working on overcoming these barriers or these obstacles that have been presented to you due to complex trauma. So I really love this, and I love just conversations like this and being able to get into this with people who work in this field like you and bringing you to the table on this. And one thing I would really love to ask you that kind of ties in here with what we've been chatting about is, since we're out here on the Master Your Mental podcast, I would love to ask you, Andrea, what are you currently doing right now in this moment to master your mental?
What I'm doing right now in my life is learning to trust myself on a
Mm.
really deep level. There are so many things constantly pulling in different directions and ideas and philosophies and what's right and what's wrong, and really leaning in on, I know what I know, and I'm stepping into my truth and allowing myself to lead myself, and that it's not from a space of ignorance. And that's what I always, will sometimes battle with myself, like, oh, well, am I being ignorant, am I being silly? But I've done a lot of healing work, and I've done a lot of I have a lot of experience in what I do. I've done a lot of trainings and a lot of personal stuff, and so now I'm really at this point where I need to just trust myself. So over the last year, that's what I've really been stepping into.
That's so beautiful, because I feel like that just ties in with so much with mental health, right? When you're able to tap into that of being more trusting of yourself and your journey in these processes, because, definitely like you said, it is easy to get caught up in those overwhelming moments or these things that we catch ourselves in, and to feel like we can't trust ourselves or trust what we're feeling or validate that. But I think that's so important and such a beautiful response and answer. And that's why I love asking this question, because you always get different things that, and I haven't heard that one before. I have not heard anyone say that. So I think that's so important. And there's so much value in that. So, Andrea, I would just love to thank you for making the time to come out here and chat with me and share your experiences, share these tips, and kind of uncover this topic of complex trauma. It was so much fun getting into this with you, and hearing your experiences and tapping into this on a more deeper level. So thank you so much for coming out. This has been amazing, and I can't wait to share it with everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Paris. It was so fun talking to you today.
Yay. Awesome. And you guys, whether you are listening to this during the daytime or the nighttime, I hope that you guys all have a great rest of your day. And I'm going to end it on that note and say bye to you guys and bye to Andrea. So bye, Andrea.
Bye, Paris.